Diana Cullell. I'm one of the lecturers at the University of Liverpool, and it's a great pleasure to be delivering this sort of course workshop on Spanish poetry from the post-war period. So it's also a very auspicious day to start the course. It's el Día del Libro, it's a book day, so we're celebrating the anniversaries of the deaths of Cervantes, Shakespeare, or you know, the approximate date in which they died. The sessions, as you can see there, so we'll have 5 sessions. Today, an introduction to the Spanish Civil War, its consequences for Spanish literature. But tomorrow, we will be reading Blas de Otero. So on Monday, we'll be reading Gil de Viedma on the generation of the 50s. Then on Wednesday, Luis Lanuda. And then the last day, we'll see the relevance of a Spanish post-war poetry for literature today. I'll start with the introduction to the Spanish Civil War and its consequences for Spanish literature. As you know, the Spanish Civil War is without a doubt one of the most well-known, one of the most researched and studied historical events of the 20th century in Spain, as are the years of the Franco dictatorship. This has captured the imagination of generations, yeah? In Spain, even more so, since the Ley de la Memoria Histórica, the historical memory law, was passed in 2007. This was a law that recognized the victims of both sides of the war, gave them rights, gave rights to their descendants, condemned the Francoist regime. And also, we've got, if you follow Spanish literature, you will have seen loads of novels that deal with the Civil War. There are loads of novels talking about the Spanish Civil War, talking about the post-war period, as it is a period that has captured the imagination, yeah, the interest of loads and loads of people. However, the poetry written during this period has not managed to seize the same attention. There are many reasons for that. This poetry has been considered by some as not a very good poetry, of not the same level as the poetry that we had seen just before the war. But also it's quite misunderstood, yeah? People tend to study the poetry of the post-war period as a big block, yeah? The poetry of the post-war period. So 40 years of worth of poetry in just one block. So that's not really what we should be doing, yeah? The way I'll explain it later, I've break it down with the generation of the 36, generation of the 50s, the poetry in exile, just to break it down a little bit. It just talks about the events in case someone is not very familiar with it. Okay, so obviously, you know, before the Spanish Civil War, we had the Second Republic, before it finished with the military uprising in July 1936, and the monarchy was ousted. This is what the monarch said at the time. Obviously, with the Spanish Civil War, this is how Spain looked, okay, in 1936. You've got there the nationalists and the Republicans, and I've given this title Las dos Españas, as we will see a poem by Blas de Otero talking about the Españas in plural, okay? So this is how the map of Spain looked in 1936, okay? The nationalists were backed by Germany, Italy, Portugal and Ireland, and the Republicans were backed by USSR and Mexico. Basically, the Republicans were seen as the anti-Catholic movement. Okay, the Spanish Republic was a lay state. Catholics were seen as, at the time, as ultra-conservatives. There had been multiple attacks on church property, etc., which obviously influenced what happened there. You've got the map again. Look how it looked 30 months later, yeah? How things had changed. You can see the nationalists gaining loads of terrain, and now the Republicans just broken, in two big groups. Until in 1939 we get to the end of the war, and Franco said, en el día de hoy cautivo y desarmado el ejército rojo, so basically announcing the end of the Spanish Civil War. You've got a video there of Franco just giving a speech after winning the Civil War and proclaiming the totalitarian state.
Armonizará en España el funcionamiento de todas las capacidades y energías del país, en el que dentro de la unidad nacional el trabajo, estimado como el más ineludible de los deberes, será el único exponente de la voluntad popular. Y merced a él podrá manifestarse el auténtico sentir del pueblo español a través de aquellos órganos naturales que, como la familia, el municipio, la asociación y la corporación, harán cristalizar en realidades nuestro ideal supremo.
Obviously, this was followed by what's known as the dictatorship, which lasted until Franco's death in 1975. This meant that, we had a totalitarian state, anti-liberal, anti-communist, a democracia orgánica, lack of constitution. There was suppression of individual freedom. Spain was proclaimed a Catholic state. There was the suppression of regionalisms, nationalisms, and obviously, and this will affect poetry, we had censorship and control of media. You will have seen nodos on YouTube, which were screened before films during the dictatorship, just propaganda of the regime, that poetry couldn't be understood outside the immediate context surrounding you, that poetry at the time needed to make sense for the people they were writing for. So that's why it's quite important to know the context, So we can also divide this post-war period in two big blocks, maybe. The immediate post-war period, so from when the war ended in 1939 to the late 50s. It's the most isolated period in Spain, due basically to not taking part in the Second World War. Poverty, underdevelopment was massive in Spain, and we had a self-sufficient economy. Things changed in the 1960s, when there was an economic boom, the end of isolation, international relationships started to be reestablished. There was the creation of a strong middle class, laws were relaxed a little bit, attitudes were more permissive. So that's why we can see these two different blocks in the dictatorship, which will affect, definitely the poetry that we will be reading. From the structure of the course, that we have no women in the course, it doesn't mean that we didn't have women poets. We did have women poets, but obviously they were not as well known as the male poets for obvious reason. Obviously during the dictatorship, as you can see on the screen, gender roles were preoccupied. So women had to be la perfecta casada, el ángel del hogar. And obviously that didn't go very well with poetry, and they were not enjoying the same education. But we do have women poets. I'm tempted to add Ernestina de Champurcin when we look at Luis Cernuda and just provide the translations myself. So if you can bear with a very poorly translated piece, I'll do that and I'll translate them myself. These are not made up. This is actually something that women received during the post-war period. Yeah, no te quejes, so be obedient to your husband. Etc. And you've got Franco's last years there, okay? So until we get to the transition, and we will see how, this is the announcement that Franco had died. So basically, when we look at the effects of this poetry in contemporary poetry, we'll see how contemporary authors look back to post-war poetry, but also to this moment of the transition, okay? So that will be quite important, the moment when Spain abandoned the dictatorship and jumped into democracy. Okay, so let me tell you a little bit about post-war poetry in general. So, in many and very obvious ways, the Spanish Civil War had a long-term negative effect, okay, on the possibilities of poetic production, as you can imagine. The destruction of war, the focus on actual survival, yeah. During and after the conflict would make literary activity seem also almost like a luxury, yeah? If you had to go without something, that would be poetry. If you were wondering where your next meal would come from, you would not be thinking about writing poetry. So let's say that, the circumstances were not the best for poetry. Also the use of propaganda, of using poetry as propaganda, limited creative goals, let's say. At the end of the war, when the nationalists emerged victorious, the country found itself in a climate of ideological concerns, underpinned by censorship, okay? Also works from poets that were writing in Spanish from Latin America were forbidden. So people could not read works by Pablo Neruda, for example. They didn't know, what the Hispanic letters were at the time. Equally important, the poets residing in Spain had been massively decimated. Yeah, just think of poets that existed before the Spanish Civil War. Antonio Machado went into exile and died 3 days just after crossing the border into France, in Collura. So he died. Federico García Lorca, one of the most important poets, a celebrity at the time, was killed at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. So those poets that would have been having a massive impact on Spanish poetry, were disappearing for one reason or another. The rest of the members of the generation of 27, Luis Cernuda, Pedro Salinas, Jorge Guillén, they all had to go into exile. So, the poets in there, in the country, had been completely decimated. It would be years before academic and literary institutions would function freely or effectively. For all these reasons, the intellectual atmosphere of the 1940s would be quite narrow. It would be a very impoverished one, as you can imagine. Given the circumstances, the fact that we've got some poetry is quite an achievement. So it's something that we need to recognize. To be able to enjoy poetry that had been written under that was amazing. I can see someone loves Lorca. Lorca is amazing. So obviously he's not from the post-war period, but if we have time, we'll read some Lorca at the end of the course, because obviously Lorca was a massive influence for the poets of the post-war period. So we'll see how In the 1940s, actually, not many books were published, but there were very, very important magazines, okay, that started to appear. And these magazines, we've got, for example, Espadaña, okay, was founded in 1944 in León, and Espadaña published a poetry that was very different to the one that we had seen in the few years immediately after the war. Yeah, as you can imagine, just after the war, the poets that got published were very aligned to the Francoist regime, and it was a very classical poetry. Espadaña in the 1940s, in the mid-1940s, a magazine started publishing just, you know, random poems here and there of authors that had very different ideas, yeah, of authors that wanted to use that magazine as a vehicle for new forms of expression, to express individual suffering, yeah, to express what people in Spain at the time were going through. So between 1945 and 1951, Espadaña published a large volume of poetry, of verse, reflecting sort of existential, yeah, and social concerns. We'll see how, you know, this existentialism, who are we, why are we alive, where are we going, why are we here? These will be concerns that we will see echoed in all this poetry all the time. Vicente Aleixandre, who is one of the authors of the generation of 27 that remained in Spain, he didn't go into exile because he was very ill, so his very poor health meant that he couldn't go into exile, and really the dictatorship didn't see him as a threat. Yeah, because, you know, he was so ill that he was defenseless, basically. So in 1955, in an essay and in a speech, in which he defined the essential theme of the current poetry, he said that it was el cántico del hombre en cuanto situado, es decir, en cuanto localizado en un tiempo que pasa y es irreversible, y localizado en un espacio, en una sociedad determinada, con unos determinados problemas que les son propios. So the English version is, this poetry is the poetry of a man situated, of a man that is located in a time that passes and is irreversible, that is located in a place, in a specific society, in specific problems that belong to it. So as you can see in here, we've got this poetry that deals with immediate issues and that would become dominant for nearly 2 decades. One could say that post-Civil War poetry had prompted a break from the universalism or irrationality of other traditions, of past traditions, and that we now have a stress on personal dilemmas, on personal experiences, on social issues. People wanted to talk about what was going on, what they felt was important. Some poets even said, you know, poetry is not eternal. We're not here to talk about roses when people are dying of hunger. So they wanted to talk about something that would be relevant, not just to them as writers, but also to the readers, to the people that would be reading them. And obviously that meant that they had to develop a completely new style, completely new narrative techniques, that they would need to employ a very, you know, easy language, or that looked easy, okay? A direct address, addressing people, addressing God, addressing an audience directly with everyday language. Gabriel Celaya, who is a very well-known author, poet of the 1936 generation, wanted to connect this poetry to everyday expression. He said, cantemos como quien respira, hablemos de lo que cada día nos ocupa, no hagamos poesía como quien va al quinto cielo o como quien posa para la posteridad. La poesía no puede ser intemporal. So let us sing as one breathes. Let us speak of what concerns us every day. Let us not make poetry as if we were seeking the fifth heaven, or like those who pose for posterity. So there was this need, of just talk about things that felt important. Blas de Otero wanted to avoid a simplistic view, and indicated that poetry's role was demostrar hermandad con la tragedia viva y luego, lo antes posible, intentar superarla. So the role of poetry was to show brotherhood, a link, a connection to the living tragedy that was war and the post-war period, and afterwards, very soon, to try to rise above it. So they saw poetry as a tool to overcome the despair of the post-war period. There have been academics and critics that have said maybe we should just talk about poesía de testimonio, like a sort of witness, poetry as a witness, and avoid talking about themes, etc. So Blas de Otero, Gabriel Celaya, the authors of the generation of the 36, had lived the Spanish Civil War as adults. Some of them had taken part in it, so they had really experienced the Spanish Civil War. The poets of the 50s had lived the Spanish Civil War as children. So they had a completely different understanding, a different perspective of what it all meant. For them, war was something that they had heard of. Obviously, they had felt the consequences, maybe being hungry or having family members who had died during the conflict. But obviously, it's very different to experience a war when you are fighting in it or where you are a child. We'll see how Hilde Viedma actually says in one of his poems that the years of the Spanish Civil War were the happiest years of his life, because he was secluded in the countryside trying to avoid war. So for him, that was wonderful. So let's see the sort of existential poetry in the 1940s, in the mid-1940s. We're starting basically in 1944. This is a poetry that is trying to get away from the pure poetry, anything experimental that had been done before the Spanish Civil War, and is trying to realign itself, come up with new different strategies. We've got authors like Vicente Aleixandre and Damaso Alonso, who were members of the Generación del 27, even writing books on this style, on really existential poetry. So Vicente Aleixandre wrote Sombra del Paraíso, Damaso Alonso Hijos de la Ira, both were published in 1944. But as we will see tomorrow, Blas de Otero is the author of some of the most impressive existential verse in Spain. He was brought up in religious schools, trained as a lawyer, and he published his first book in 1942. It was called Cántico Espiritual, so a direct reference to San Juan de la Cruz by Luis de León. But in that work, he already suggests that he's struggling with faith, with who he is, so all these existential matters. And this struggle becomes really real in the works that he publishes in 1950 and 1951, Ángel fieramente humano and Redoble de conciencia. So I've got in here the two books that were republished in 1958 as Ansia, which is the first two letters of the first book, Ángel fieramente humano, and the last two of Redoble de conciencia. So it's not a poetry that is just talking about existential problems in an abstract way, he's asking for answers in that poem. But we'll see how this poetry also has amazing control through form and image of feelings that could have easily engendered, sentimental screaming, let's say. So he talks about things very carefully. And he uses a very wide formal repertoire, different varieties of verse, forms, tones, rhythmic effects, intertext, discourse, etc. So that's what we find in the mid-40s to the early 50s, before this poetry turns more into something social. Yeah, so it's still, in a sense, existential, but some of these poets that want to show solidarity with other human beings go a step further. So the social, the political themes start to be more obvious, maybe because the censorship at the time had relaxed a little bit, or at least at some point during the 50s, and they were more allowed to make more obvious references to political issues. So there was, in the 50s, with this turn into a more social poetry, a goal of constructing a powerful new realistic literature that was suited to the circumstances, that was more than just testimonial. So, though envisioned by the poems that we had seen in the previous years, and in what we had seen in Espadaña being published there, in the 1950s and 1960s, these poets got in touch with the outside world. So Blas de Otero, for example, moved to Paris for a while in the 50s, met communist authors, joined communism. So he became much more socially and politically aware, if that was possible. And obviously that influenced his poetry massively, gave it an awareness that it was lacking before. So as the country's isolation from Europe was attenuated, and when the United States and other countries reestablished diplomatic relationships with Spain, the forbidden text by other authors, by authors that were outside, became available. Writers had an incentive to follow their lead and to compose something that was more political, let's say. So as I've said, censorship was less absolute, although we will see some exceptions with Blas de Otero tomorrow. And actually poetry seemed to be the one genre in which postures of protest were allowed to be published, surprisingly. So novels or theatre faced more censorship than poetry, which is quite surprising, but hey, we won't complain. Obviously in the 50s and 60s, tourism started to become a boom in Spain, and that meant new ideas, opening the country, and there was a shift in the focus of poetry from a personal anguish reaction to larger themes, as well as some enrichment of the literary scene. And we will see how the poets of the 1950s, so the poets that started publishing in the very, very late 50s, in the early 60s, they said, well, listen, I mean, this poetry is fantastic, but we need to do more, We need to be more challenging. We need to write a poetry that is social and engaged, that it's, it goes with what's happening, but we need to do it properly. So we will see how Jaime Gil de Viedma took it on board to move poetry from being communication, to being knowledge. This started a massive discussion between the poets on whether poesía needed to be comunicación, this communication or conocimiento. Was poetry just a tool to communicate something, or was it a tool so that you could learn, so that you could become better, so that you could discuss themes and issues that were important, but in a more, cultivated way. So we will see this shift into this poetry in the 1960s that looks more at the formal aspects, without obviously ignoring the political aspects that went with it. And obviously in the 60s, censorship was really, really diminished, which allowed poets in the 60s to really publish what they wanted, or almost what they wanted. Foreign literature, classic and current highbrow, lowbrow, as well as works by previously censored Spanish writers and exiled writers became available. New magazines and poetry series appeared, increasing publication outlets. The Adonai series and the prize, which had been instituted in 1943 to stimulate poetry, had actually become a prestigious source and incentive for younger poets. So it is against this backdrop that new attitudes towards poetry developed, although the changing cultural scene had, as I said, varying effects on different writers. It's quite interesting because obviously at the time we've got two generations writing at the same time, with different perspectives, different views of what a social poetry is. So as I've said, this younger generation experienced the Spanish Civil War as children or adolescents. So basically maybe as victims rather than as actors in it. And obviously the way they were brought up, the teaching, the education that they received was also quite instrumental in what we will see. I wanted to read you something about how they saw this poetry. So José Ángel Valente, one of the poets of the 1950s, in one of his articles about comunicación, conocimiento y comunicación, so poetry as communication or just knowledge, said something quite interesting. He said, todo poema es, pues, una exploración del material de experiencia no previamente conocido que constituye su objeto. El conocimiento más o menos pleno del poema supone la existencia más o menos plena del poema en cuestión. De allí que el proceso de la creación poética sea un movimiento de indagación y tanteo, porque todo poema es un conocimiento haciéndose. Every poem is therefore an exploration of the matter of experience not previously known, which constitutes its goal. The more or less complete knowledge of the poem supposes the more or less complete existence of the poem in question. Hence, the process of poetic creation is a process of investigation and testing, because all poem is knowledge in process of becoming. So they saw the poem as an act of discovery, which not only contradicted the definition of poetry as message, as a communication that had been prevalent in Spain, but also undermined the long-standing modern poetics of the literary work. Gil de Viedma, we will see, elaborated this idea on several occasions and developed the notion of the poem as an interplay between the author and the reader. So while in the first generation the reader was important because they shared something, in here there is a massive expectation from the the poet towards the reader. Yeah, the reader have to deconstruct the poem, just find the meaning behind it. So we are asking a lot of the reader, as we will see. But they still saw social poetry as, you know, a tool for the betterment of the whole. But it had to be coupled, as I said, with a successful poetic expression. So it had to be more than just a message. It's been fantastic to have you all here. I hope you have enjoyed it. Maybe it's been a bit boring today, but I just needed to give you this context so that the poetry that we read from tomorrow onwards will make sense. Yeah. Right. So I'll see you tomorrow at 4 o'clock. Okay. Bye. Thank you.